to the right, 438. The noes to the left, 20. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
For Boris Johnson, it was fourth time lucky. The fourth time he has called for an early election. This time, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn voted in favour. That was the difference. And so on December the 12th, the UK will go to the polls.
We are left with no choice but to go to the country to break free from this impasse and to allow us all to submit, as we must, in all humility, to the judgment of the electorate, and to allow us to make our case, and above all, to allow a new and revitalised Parliament with a new mandate to deliver on the will of the people and get Brexit done.
The Prime Minister's attempt to push through his newly agreed Brexit deal failed. MPs wanted more time to scrutinise and perhaps change it to their liking. So he's taking a gamble, going to the polls without having delivered Brexit, desperate for a clear majority to get it done. Later on Tuesday night, he addressed his MPs, preparing them for the campaign ahead. It's a risk for Corbyn too. Many Labour MPs are nervous about their leader's lack of popular appeal, and they are trailing in the polls. He's promising a radical agenda.
We are ready for an election. We're going to go out there with a very strong message of how we transform our society to end inequality and injustice and deal with the devastating poverty that so many people face.
Voters will get a clear choice on Brexit. Johnson's deal, Labour's promise to get a better one, and a choice of cancelling it altogether. As usual, there'll be big promises to spend on struggling public services like health and education. And if the last few months are anything to go by, the campaign will be bad-tempered. So the final days of this Parliament are now in sight. Boris Johnson will get his general election. Unusually, it will be in December. His opponents will make much of the fact that he failed in his central promise of delivering Brexit by the end of October. He will counter that he did everything in his power to do it, but was thwarted by Parliament. It's a narrative he will take to the country. People versus Parliament. It will be a bitter campaign, and it will be dominated by Brexit. Simon McGregor-Wood, TRT World, London.
Well, for more on this, Jonathan Portes joins us now from London. He's a Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College and is a Senior Fellow at the university's independent research body on UK-EU relations. Welcome to Money Talks, Jonathan. Now that Boris Johnson has got his wish for early elections, do you think it will get Brexit done, as the Prime Minister says it will?
Well, that will depend on what happens in the election. And as you said, it's very, very difficult to predict the result of this election, one of the most unpredictable we've had in a long time. I think it's fair to say that if Boris Johnson wins a majority, then it is highly likely that he will be able to pass his Brexit deal through Parliament, and we will leave the EU probably sometime in January of next year. If, on the other hand, he doesn't get a majority and the combined opposition forces don't, then it's very difficult to say what will happen. But we could easily have a second referendum on whether or not we should indeed leave the EU.
Yes, so let's look at an alternative outcome. The polls put Boris Johnson's Conservatives in a commanding lead over Labour at the moment. But as we know, polls in the UK have a habit of getting it wrong in recent times. But how would a Jeremy Corbyn victory affect Brexit?
Well, I don't think a Jeremy Corbyn victory, an outright victory, is very plausible at the moment, but it is certainly not impossible that the combined opposition parties, the Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalist Party and other minor parties, have more seats than the Conservatives. In those circumstances, I think the most likely outcome would be a very temporary agreement between those parties, because, of course, those parties have very big differences on policy issues. But I think we would have a temporary government of those parties, which would see as its main goal pushing through a referendum on the future of Brexit. So what we'd have is a very unstable political situation, an unstable government, but quite possibly a referendum on Brexit. So this is very much the election which will determine the future of Brexit.
Yes, and you mentioned two of those smaller parties, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party. I guess for an international audience, much of the debate has been around Labor and the Conservatives, but we know the Lib Dems and the SNP are both anti-Brexit parties. They're going to try everything in their power to stop it. If Labor or even the Conservatives are forced into a coalition with either one of them, do you think that might stop Brexit?
Well, as I said, I think a coalition is unlikely because the parties have fairly irreconcilable differences on a number of major policies. But I think a temporary agreement between the opposition parties to have a Brexit referendum is quite plausible. I don't see how, under current circumstances, the Liberal Democrats or the SNP could enter a coalition with the Conservatives, given, as you say, their fundamental opposition to the Conservatives' main policy, which is to get Brexit done. So if the Conservatives don't win a majority, then this could be the election that stops Brexit. That isn't the most likely outcome, but it's certainly not an impossible one.
Interesting. Now, while Brexit was the catalyst for this election, all parties, I presume, are going to be campaigning on a whole range of issues. Let's look at the Labor Party platform. Some in the business community are quite worried about Jeremy Corbyn's policies, including a promise to overhaul regulation of the financial system and nationalising certain utilities. Could a Labor government be bad for business?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's quite interesting about how British politics has developed over the last few years is that if you'd said 10 years ago that Labour, you have a Conservative government on the one hand and a Labour opposition led by Jeremy Corbyn, very much on the left of his party, with a programme of wholesale nationalisation and various other interventions in the economy, of course, you'd have said, well, business will really, really hate that. It would be they'll much prefer a Conservative government. But the fact is, Brexit has rather dominated things, and you can make a perfectly plausible case that actually, taking everything into account, a Boris Johnson-led hard Brexit would, for some sectors of British industry, be considerably more damaging than a Jeremy Corbyn government. I think it's fair to say that, therefore, that business is not particularly attracted to either side of the debate, in the sense that, on the one hand, they are certainly unhappy with some of the proposals that Mr. Corbyn is bringing forward, but on the other, they recognise that the sort of Brexit that Boris Johnson is proposing, a much harder Brexit, it should be noted, than Theresa May is proposing, is going to result in considerable disruption to the UK's very important trade with the rest of Europe. So it's not a very comfortable position for many in the business community.
So do you think a hard Brexit is still on the table? Or Jeremy Corbyn says that he supported this early election because he was confident that a hard Brexit was no longer an issue. But
well, no, that's not right. What he said was that he was confident that a no-deal Brexit had been taken off the table, and that's true. A no-deal Brexit has been taken off the table, at least to the end of this extension. And I think, given that there is no major party supporting a no-deal Brexit, I think it probably is pretty unlikely, except by accident. But that doesn't mean a hard Brexit is off the table. The Brexit proposal, the Johnson deal, points the UK very much towards a hard Brexit, in the sense of one where we have, at most, a fairly minimal free trade agreement with the European Union, and certainly by the standards of what we were talking about a couple of years ago, that does translate to a hard Brexit. And all the economic analyses, I mean, our group produced one a couple of weeks ago showing the economic impact of the Johnson Brexit proposals, and that is that economic impact would be, in the long term, quite significant, quite severe, possibly up to 5, 6, or 7% off UK GDP over a 10-year period. That looks, I think, to most people like a hard Brexit, not a no-deal Brexit, but a hard Brexit.
Interesting. Okay, Jonathan Portes, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for your analysis.